Folks starting to come in, and so we'll give them a minute here to sort of get out of the waiting room, and then we'll kind of get underway. In the meantime, just a few ground rules, I guess, for the logistics. Today we're if you do have any questions regarding the presentation today, feel free to use the chat feature to put those questions or ask those questions. We will try to save most questions for until the end of the presentation. We have budgeted some time to have the project team sort of answer any questions regarding the presentation then. But if there are some burning questions that sort of come to mind as the presentation is sort of unfolding, definitely feel free to ask those, and we can kind of juggle that process as well. But we are trying to we do have a lot of cover today, and so we definitely want to make sure we save that chunk of time near the end to ensure that everyone has a chance to kind of ask those questions. And so I see that we've got a pretty good cohort going, so I guess I'll kind of go ahead and get us underway here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Funk. I'm with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And today, really excited to have the project team for the Upper Colorado Consumptive Use Research Project with us today. We're going to be sharing some sort of initial year one results from the project and a little bit about the history of the project and sort of where it fits in the sort of grand scheme of things in terms of better understanding how alternative transfer methods and voluntary temporary compensated conservation programs are working within the ag community on the Western Slope. And so with that, like I said, we have a lot to cover, so I'll kind of get us started. I wanted to kind of just start with kind of a quick background on sort of the role that the Water Conservation Board has played in sort of developing some support for alternative transfer methods and conservation efforts in Colorado. If you're not familiar with the CWCB, we are the state's lead water policy and planning agency within the State Department of Natural Resources, and manage a number of programs, including a program designed to support alternative transfer methods and water sharing agreements through a standalone grant program. And a few reasons that sort of led to the development of that program and sort of the state's sort of interest in these projects is really twofold. One being that irrigated agriculture is, of course, a very critical part of the state's economy. It contributes a significant amount to the state's overall gross domestic product, particularly on the Western Slope and in other sort of rural parts of the state. It remains a sort of critical economic backbone in terms of not only direct jobs, but also as a economic multiplier in terms of looking at both backward and forward linkages in that economy. So everything from equipment dealers to sort of other inputs. There are obviously the irrigated agriculture supports a wide range of businesses and a really vibrant economy in places like the Western Slope. Irrigated agriculture is also obviously really important in terms of its public benefits, everything from providing critical wildlife habitat to carbon sequestration, to maintaining open spaces and sort of the landscapes that a lot of Coloradans highly value and support. With that in mind, given that Colorado as a semi-arid state, water resource decision-making and drivers are actually play a huge role in development trends of irrigated agriculture. And so this slide sort of just quickly shows that kind of looking at our technical update to the state water plan, it highlights three really kind of key drivers that are affecting the loss of irrigated lands in the state. And those ones that we'll really talk mostly about today are, planned ag to urban transfers, or sort of this process of buy and dry, or sort of this development of ag water rights to sort of meet growing demands, be it on the Front Range or other parts of the state. Urbanization, sort of development and land use planning decisions affect permanent development of irrigated acreage. And then there are a number of intrastate and interstate sort of issues that affect permanent drive as well. So, in places like the Rio Grande and the Republican Basin, there are a number of groundwater sustainability issues that are potentially requiring some irrigated acreage to come out of production to sort of meet different conservation goals and to meet different sort of compact drivers in those basins. And the same can be really seen in other parts of the state as well. All to say that water does play a really significant role in sort of driving some of this dry up, and that dry up can have pretty significant effects in terms of economic impacts and environmental impacts to the communities where agriculture plays a really critical role. And so with that backdrop, when the Colorado Water Plan was initially being developed prior to 2015, one of the sort of key directives in that executive order was sort of the recognition that the rate of buy and dry and sort of the loss of irrigated lands was unacceptable, and that there was a sort of desire to support alternative transfer methods, or sort of alternatives to that trend, to do really two things. One, minimizing permanent reductions in irrigated acreage, but also really to reduce some of the third-party impacts or externalities that result from some of these permanent reductions. And those externalities are typically not captured in sort of your standard change of use process, or sort of other sort of procedures that move water to different uses. And so the ATM program that was developed as a result of that is really focused on developing sort of workable projects and kind of show that there are different ways to sort of meet these growing needs, or to address these different sort of water resource issues in a way that benefits agriculture in these rural communities. And so it sets a goal in which to do that. On the western slope, there have actually been a pretty significant number of projects that have been supported through the CWCB ATM grant program, kind of dating all the way back to 2010 with the formation of the Colorado Water Banking Working Group that formed really to kind of study the potential for a voluntary compensated approach to conservation on the western slope. Discussions from that group really set the stage for many projects, including the one you'll hear more about today. But just some of the other sort of projects that have informed this process are the Grand Valley Project, which really looked at how a large irrigation canal system could potentially administer a voluntary, temporary, and compensated conservation program. The city of Aspen is actually actively considering a water sharing opportunity right now that would be designed to bolster municipal supplies and in-stream flows in response to drought conditions. And once enacted, that would sort of potentially be the first ag to muni water sharing arrangement on the western slope. And then of course the project today, which is really focusing on so through all these discussions, there was sort of this like key research gap of sort of how these voluntary, temporary, compensated water sharing type projects would really work in a high elevation pasture-based or sort of grass-based system, which is the predominant land use on the western slope. And so really critical to understanding some of the agronomic and sort of economic impacts that can kind of result or benefit from these types of projects. And then I think just finally here, and kind of where we kind of see the state program kind of moving forward is really that, while the conversations around alternative transfer methods and water sharing agreements really did come out of that discussion around buy and dry and sort of urban demand, and that's where you kind of see these projects like the Catlin Canal Project in the Arkansas Basin. really in recent years, a lot of the focus has been more on the Western Slope in terms of how these types of projects can potentially address interstate water issues or sort of work to create system benefits through voluntary conservation programs, and then even how they could potentially work to address things, everything from in-stream flows to recreational flows and other emerging opportunities on the Western Slope as well. And then even in places like the Rio Grande, we're seeing potentially some interest in ATMs to help address augmentation concerns and other compact issues. So I think overall, these water sharing arrangements have really expanded over time to address a number of issues, and that, I think this is going to hopefully not, potentially going to be an interesting trend as we look at the water plan update and kind of how this program evolves over time. And so with that, I'm going to kind of hand over the reins to our project team to kind of discuss this project in more depth. So Paul, Perry, y'all take it away.
Thank you so much, Alex. Everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Good morning. I think Alex did a great job of setting the stage there. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Paul Bruchet. My family ranches just outside of Kremling in Grand County, Colorado. I'm the vice chair in the Ag Rep to the Colorado Basin Roundtable, as well as a governor appointee to the Inter-Basin Compact Committee. I think that it's important to set the stage for why this and how this came to be. So back in 2019, I had some conversations with Dr. Perry Cabot while the Colorado Basin Roundtable had developed a work group on demand management. Dr. Perry Cabot expressed his concerns about the lack of science information data regarding measuring consumptive use and conserved consumptive use at high altitude perennials. While there had been smaller size projects, there was nothing that had been done at scale, and wanted to potentially launch a project to answer a number of these questions. We talked about it at the roundtable level. The roundtable was very excited, but it was at the same time that the CWCB had just launched their work groups on demand management. We felt that we were getting a little bit ahead of the CWCB. I participated in the Ag Impacts work group on demand management. The conversation within that work group basically spun the same direction as the Colorado Basin Roundtable, where if we have questions that could be answered, why don't we pursue forward in trying to answer them? With that, we went back to the roundtable, had the conversation. The roundtable wanted to launch the project. So with that, the process begun of applications and moving forward on an application to the CWCB for an ATM grant, just as Alex had just explained. And on March 11th, the CWCB voted yes, and then we had a project. Next slide, please, Alex. So with that today, as a roadmap, here's what we're looking to do: give you a little bit more purpose and overview, discuss the components, their linkages, and then Dr. Perry Cabot and Seth are going to actually talk about some results. Very exciting. And moving on into the future of what we're looking at. Next slide, please. So for a project of this magnitude, you can take a look here, and I'm not going to read them for the sake of time, but with funding from the CWCB, the roundtable launching the project, the 4 top partners being the management team in general, and all the support to get the project done, and then all the other organizations and entities below being very significant to the project for all the additions and things that we've looked at in evaluation. And it's our great thanks to everybody who participated. As you can see, it's taken a number of us to get a project of this scale completed. Next slide, please. So the total project, we had 9 different project participants, total of 1,142 acres. 159 acres of that were split season or deficit, where the producer was allowed to irrigate up until June 15th, and then no more water to the field for the rest of the year after June 15th. Very important within this that we understand treatment versus reference and how we did this. So in order to understand the project, the treatment is where there was some form of water conservation activity that was completed, whether it was the full season or whether it was the split season or deficit. The reference probably could interchange the word control. These were fields that the producers irrigated as they have historically. So the continued normal irrigation practices, studying both sides. Next slide, please. a little more detail on this to give an example of what this was, because scale was a very important thing for the purpose of this research. Within the reference fields, each landowner participated. To give an example of this, in 3 of the key ranches that participated in this, there was one ranch that had 2 different treatment fields. One of them was 330 acres in size, another was 190 acres in size. The reference field for that was approximately 72 acres. Another key ranch to this, the treatment was 213 acres, the reference was 25. And then another one that was a split season. Those 2 were both full season curtailments. Another one that was a split season had 124 acres participate, and then 22 is their reference field, to give an idea. And just a point of clarification, after 2020, everyone is reverting back to historical irrigation practices. There is a slight chance that we might look at some very small scale plots to continue to test recovery of the fields, but they would be very small in scale and not have impacts to the larger study. Next slide, please. So, more specifically within our goals, I think that you all can read the slide, but very important to how we wanted to do this. And so what started with a pretty simple concept to do some tests on this regarding water in general. We also wanted to understand what this meant for the ranches, their practices, and then what else we could add to the project. And as we go through this presentation, we'll give some more details on that. Next slide, please. I think also important because, for this presentation, I think we want to simplify what we talk about with consumptive use and conserved consumptive use. So consumptive use being the amount of water applied to a pasture that is consumed by plants via evaporation and transpiration, evapotranspiration or ET. Conserved consumptive use, the amount of water which consumptive use is reduced as a result of changing irrigation or other water management practices. Next slide, please. So with that, this became the story of, we had the 2 basic goals of the project, but how much could we add on to really work to focus as much information and knowledge as possible regarding this. And I want to stress that while this project came to be based on conversations of demand management, this is not in any way a demand management project. The state is still sorting through the feasibility of demand management, as is the Upper Basin. This was strictly a research project, and here's a good list of what became our research goals within that. But to stress that in no way was this a demand management program, it was a research project. Next slide, please. So the ranch enterprise budgets became a near and dear to my heart part of this project, because while the science and research relative to understanding if we were going to not apply water to high altitude perennial fields, and understand how much water we could save in the process of doing that, we also wanted to understand the economics of what this meant for the rancher. And so, this would be the goal of going in heads up that, I think when you look at a hay meadow, you can say, well, historically, this hay meadow is baled 250 tons of hay. Hay is worth this amount of money. But then the breakdowns of what it means for the different residual amount of pasture for a cow-calf operation or yearling operation, what it means for recovery and everything else, deep into the economics for the ranchers. So this will be ongoing for the next several years and is an important part of our research project. Next slide, please. The social science. So this was very fun to talk about 9 different ranchers' feelings. I had the privilege of touring around, and while I did not participate in the interviews, it was fascinating to be a part of. 5 of these ranchers I talked to the entire winter, basically going into the CWCB board meeting on March 11th about the project. They were pretty much locked on board if the grant came to be. Others joined kind of later in the process based on ease of the project and the work. But what I found in this entire project, most especially from the social science portion, is that we can talk about conserved water and what it means to agriculture in boardrooms. And when we actually go to apply the project, it's a very different feeling. It's a very different results than what a boardroom meeting can have. And being a long-term ag producer, being involved in all of these different meetings, it's quite fascinating. And so, year 1 to then extend on to future years as these meadows recover and these people understand, why the purpose of this project. I think it'll be fascinating for all of you and at a level of the state, that we're able to discuss this in kind of less of a 30,000 foot planning view to actual real life practice and how it happened. Next slide, please. So with this, I think that I love this slide for a purpose of this presentation, because if I tried to explain this, it would take the remaining portion of the entire presentation. But I think when we look at a water conservation project in agriculture, we can think about it as being as simple as turning on or turning off a head gate or turning it on. But the reality of this project and what it looks like for the kinds of goals that we were seeking to achieve for purposes of informing others about what actually occurred, this is what it looks like, which is a relatively complicated project, and why all the different project partners that it took to achieve this. So far, I'm excited that we've had great success. And with that now, to the bigger point of this, I would like to hand it off to the world famous Dr. Perry Cabot.
Well, thank you, Paul. Hopefully not world famous, it's just more phone calls all the time. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks again for the opportunity to do this talk. I'm going to set my timer here for 30 minutes so that we can kind of stay on track. Next slide, Alex. And as Paul said, we'll just be going through our 2020 results and activities, which I should emphasize will be further summarized in a more full-length report to the CWCB. Alex, next slide. I'm going to sort of, MC the rest of the results section here, and I'll hand it off to Seth Mason at the river flow impact portion of it. But as Paul said, we've engaged a fairly large consumptive use research project using a tool called remote sensing, which I think many folks are familiar with, and some are not. If they aren't, I'll be covering what that technique really means. Forage evaluation in our language basically is everything that encompasses the amount of reduction in yield that occurs on fields that are undergoing these curtailments, as well as the part of that producers are more interested in, which is the ongoing recovery, which could last several years, to see how long it takes these fields to come back into production. And that leads into the aspect of what we call enterprise budgeting, which is the impact of economic impact of these practices on the farms themselves. And so that'll be a third element of what I talk about at the end. I'll cover just a brief synopsis of what this social science research actually means, and then I'll hand it over to Seth for number 5 on the river flow impacts. Next slide, Alex. So as I mentioned, I would talk a little bit about what remote sensing means and what our in-field data is. Basically, our goal here is to use this particular tool to make estimates. I like to say estimates when we come down to remote sensing, because measurements of ET, obviously water is a mass flux, and so measuring evapotranspiration, if you take the true definition of the word measure, is not possible unless you use lysimetry technology. I think it's really critical to talk about why this project arose, and Paul likes to point to my, I guess, observation that this was a necessary step forward for consumptive use evaluation in the state. And I should say that I was persuaded by a report that URS put together, I think it was in 2013, that did identify high elevation pastures as being sort of a data gap in the evaluation, in the consumptive use numbers that we classically use. So prior technology, everybody's, most folks that are kind of working this area know about the lysimetry technology and great work that was done by Ivan Walter and Grant Carlson, in some cases right directly in Grand County. But the problem is that lysimetry technology, just by the basic nature of what it is a single point of analysis. And, notwithstanding the fact it was the best available technology at the time, you're still getting data from one single spot in a field. And whether that data is translatable or scalable is a worthwhile question to ask, particularly when we're enrolling entire fields in these kinds of programs. And so as lysimetry technology was, further developed in parallel with sort of the advent of remote sensing technology and tools and models came to be, and that's of course why OpenET is a big part of this project. So it's a necessary, logical question to ask. Well, how do those tools really compare with what we, classically understand to be consumptive use? On my next point, the answer to the question why we care about that, because the largest water consumer, at least in terms of evapotranspiration on the western slope, is of course irrigated pastures. So if we're trying to understand the inventory, so to speak, of available consumptive use, I think using a tool that we can broadly apply to the entire western slope is a worthwhile endeavor. And so there again, the third point is that I think this project is important because it's not going to be possible to put sensors and lysimeters and eddy covariance towers at every location that Colorado might choose or landowners might choose to enroll in these programs. It's only going to be possible to assess consumptive use at a scale that's massive with a tool that we can use from space. So the goal I have had on this project is, and I think the team agrees, is that we're not here to say, well, we're trying to perfectly understand Grand County water use. I think it's worthwhile to say, well, we're trying to use a tool here, validate its accuracy on high elevation pastures, such that we can gain some confidence that this tool is what I call scalable and translatable. That is, field size is smaller, tool still works. Field size is somewhere else, tool still works. Possibly different grass species engaged, tool still works. Really, really sensible approach to trying to reduce the cost of these evaluations. And it's a unique application to curtailed irrigation. This hasn't been done before. It's really hard to get producers to not irrigate their fields except during droughts. And so we had an opportunity here to look at a really low floor on consumptive use at a large scale that hasn't been done before. Next slide, Alex. Remote sensing, for those of you that don't know, is basically the use of satellite technology. We have a number of satellites in the Landsat system circling the Earth, and they make series of passes every 8 days. You can then convert the data collected from these remote satellites into an evapotranspiration estimate. The kind of data it ranges from everything from measurement of reflectance of visible light to energy fluxes, which of course, when you think of cooling and the cooling effect of water, you can take those energy fluxes and convert those into an ET estimate. It's worth mentioning here at this point that the term model gets used a lot in this language, and all that really is the use of this kind of data in order to apply that to an algorithm. We take that algorithm and then we make this ET estimate. And so those ET estimates are done at pixel scale with 30 by 30 meter pixels that satellite is able to see. And so, within 100 acres or so, you can really pack a lot of pixels in there. You can capture a lot of the heterogeneity of the field ET. A unique part of this project then was that we were fortunate to be able to install in-field sensors, on-the-ground sensors, in order to take further estimates, make further estimates, and then compare these things, from space to the ground. The satellite comes every 8 days. The sensors can measure every, couple minutes. So, kind of in order to sort of surf between these 8-day passes and use data in between, having that on in-field data allows us to make these daily estimates of ET, or combine them into monthly estimates. So next slide, please, Alex. This is kind of an example of where you start in in a remote sensing tool. This is a satellite image. Most folks are pretty aware of what an ortho photo looks like. It kind of gives you an idea of how many pixels you can sort of cram into a field this size. This is a map of one of our systems where we have an irrigated field right in there that looks a little bit like, I guess, a Scottish terrier or something like that. And then you've got your treatment fields on the other side, which of course are pretty heavily brown and down. And, you know, there's a little bit of heterogeneity in there. The fields are not perfectly non-irrigated, but we are, you know, we're able to capture a lot of data with this tool at the scale of the field itself. Go ahead to the next slide, Alex. What do you do with that data then is you, as I said, you apply what's called an ET model to the spectral signature and the energy flux data coming off the field, and then you take and you can further take the data and apply it to other models. So there are about 5 different ET models that get used to make these ET estimates that OpenET, through their great work, has done for us. This is just an example of one single snapshot on a good day for a satellite pass on July 18th. So this kind of packing of all these model results together for every single one of those pixels gets us to where we have a term called the Ensemble Model. And what that basically is the median of the results of the 5 different models that are used. And that median use allows us to not be affected heavily by any kind of strong outliers in the estimate. So right now we're focused just on looking at the results of the Ensemble Model to take advantage of all the work that's been done over the past several decades on coming up with these estimates. That's the next step. Well, before I go to the next slide, I want to say, in order to calculate an ET estimate of an entire field, what you then do is you take the average of all the pixels that are lying within that field itself, so that then you get a spatial average for that particular day. And then kind of staying with me here, the next bit of steps involves how do you take that 8-day snapshot, the next 8-day snapshot, the next 8-day snapshot, use the in-field data to get you the daily ET rates, and then you further take that into this realm of the spatial average for the field. And so I know that's kind of a lot of modeling to talk about all at once, but what you end up with is the ability to get a spatial average of ET on basically whatever time scale you like. The most reliable would be, you know, within the monthly range, which, you know, coincidentally is sort of in the same range as what, you know, these periods would be looking at. So focus on the term spatial average ET as we keep going through that, because this will come up a little bit later. Next slide, Alex. This is a great slide that Matt Brownlee came up with for our data. So if you look at the departure of ET, the spatial average ET, the departure of the 2020 numbers from the prior data sets between 2016 and 2019. So we have those years available to us because we've done this sort of look back at these ET rates on these fields. So we can get a spatial average of the 2016-2019 data for every single field. This is an annual estimate here. And then we can get the spatial average of the 2020 data. You can then, this is just kind of an example that summarizes a lot of data for these particular fields. Again, same one with the Scottish Terrier there. The departure from the 2020 ET rate departure from the previous year, it gets down into the range of about, not quite 50%. You can see that color ramp down at the bottom, but we're in the range of about 45% reduction in ET for the 2020 season on these fields relative to the prior years that we've looked at. So that 45% number is, you know, I would sort of submit is a pretty reliable number considering how much space it has really looked at. It's not just one single point, but, you know, spatial average across 600 acres is pretty a pretty reliable number for these high elevation pastures. Next slide, Alex. This is just kind of another way of summarizing this, not just for the GPR fields that I showed you, and you can see on that site column that you get your fully, which is the F, fully curtailed, and then you get your P, which is the partially curtailed. These are the numbers in inches of the annual ET rate for the season, and then the numbers over there, and you get your 2020 number. And I want to make a quick correction. I believe these are actually just the May through sort of a summer season, May through I think September, October time period. It might be a little, it seems a little bit low. But at any rate, for that important time period during which the lease is really being, the water is really being curtailed, because those, shoulder months, January and December, are not, there's not a lot of ET happening. You can see the percent reduction on the T fields. You've got that T, anything with a parentheses is a T field. You take you got a 56% reduction, 47%, 37%, and those are for the fully irrigated fields for that time period. Important to note, so that's where that color ramp this is more quantitatively represented here. Average of about 45% reduction there. The interesting thing I like to point out about this is that if you look at those reference fields, anything with an R, some of them actually have negative reduction, which basically means there was more ET on those fields than prior years, at least as represented by the spatial average, which doesn't really surprise me, because it's sort of a hot year and you get water, you probably produce more ET due to those extra heat units. You take the average, though, of all the reference fields, and so even though it's 4 numbers, it represents a spatial average, so there's hundreds of numbers packed into those single percent reduction column numbers. You come up with more or less the same average ET from the previous years. And so although it was an exceptionally hot year, in terms of like reference condition irrigation, it wasn't markedly different in 2020 versus the 4 years prior. You can kind of see there at the RSR, that middle one there, right about where it's parentheses P, the split season doesn't really reduce the seasonal ET that greatly. We're looking at like a 15% reduction. Doesn't surprise me, because you've got this carryover moisture condition, and then you get into cooler periods after the cutoff date. Next slide, Alex. Just to kind of summarize the consumptive use research numbers, I just a basic comparison, sort of a take-home number to think about here is that the average percent reduction for there it is, the May-August consumptive use compared to the 2016-2019 period is about 45%. So if you allow that the 2016-19 period would be sort of an accurate reference of fully irrigated, and then we use our 2020 data to make that comparison, we're looking at about a 45% reduction in ET. I know a lot of times the effective precip discussion comes up a lot. How do you really handle that? And I guess we need more folks to weigh in on that. But my opinion would be, and it's just based on I think an intuitive sense, is that the effective precip would affect both fields similarly. And so, whatever ET is resulting from that addition of effective precip would still sort of be baked into this 45%. Now that may be, we want to examine that a little bit more. If you take just the 2020 reference data compared to the 2020 treatment data, we're looking at about a 42% reduction. So they're within the ballpark. And, that 42% could be manifest by the fact that we actually had slightly, maybe in some cases, higher ET rates in the 2020 season. So there you get into kind of how do you, begin to interpret this data in the realm of conserved consumptive use. Next slide, please, Alex. if we step into the world of how do we take our fields, field in sensor, field sensor data, and compare that with our OpenET data, again, referring to the fact that we've got this Ensemble Model data. So every one of those red dots represents that median average of the Ensemble Model ET estimate applied to that particular field. So we only have one eddy covariance tower, but if you look at that field, that pixel, if you will, the estimate, I'm sorry, that eddy covariance tower is located within one single pixel. Although it does take a fairly large, has a large fetch around it, about 600 feet. It sort of takes an estimate of what that value is. If you take that footprint of ET versus the result from the Ensemble Model footprint, if you will, for those two sort of equivalent spatial areas, and compare them, you end up with a pretty significant R-squared number. That's that 0.9396. So we've almost got a one-for-one relationship on this fully curtailed field footprint as measured in field versus as measured by the OpenET ensemble. And so that begins to get us to where we can start confirming the accuracy of the OpenET results at very low irrigated conditions, which again was a major goal of this project. So this is seems like everything goes right with this project. So I'm really happy to see that. Next slide. The forage research then is related to some pretty simple questions, at least so far as year one. I mean, you don't need a person with a PhD to tell you that if you don't irrigate a field, your yields are going to go down. But what's really going to be interesting as we go forward and why we do these forage evaluations is to look at not just the same year impact of the reduced zero irrigation, but the subsequent year impacts on both yield, quality, and we can even be talking about possible species succession. So that'll be really interesting to look at these yield impacts, because there again, that's what the producer thinks, and they're selling. And it's not so much about a water equation for them when they're thinking of the monetary compensation. It's, well, how much yield am I really losing? So field this big then gives us the opportunity to do a forage evaluation within this little research enclosure, which you might recall a few slides back, there was this kind of cool, cow panel surrounded circle thing. That's where we keep our instrumentation. So we've got this kind of protected spot that we look at, and then we take a composite sample around that. And then through my years of doing this, I've learned, you always have to get the bale counts as well for the whole field, so you can really talk about producer scale and research scale. So yeah, that recovery study will be ongoing, and you'll get used to looking at these kinds of data points as we go forward. Next slide, Alex. I've got a few slides here with some charts that summarize or more or less confirm or detail what this slide says. But just so you all are aware, we get that 40-some% reduction in ET over the course of the season. That corresponds obviously to significant reductions in biomass. And so our June sampling that we did, we were fortunate to get every month we got samples of how much forage was there. Our June sampling, had us, as compared to reference conditions, at about a 73% reduction in dry matter biomass. Our treatment versus reference. Then we get in second July sampling, we're looking at like 87%. And that gets around to the time period where producers would start actually haying those fields. So that effective stored soil moisture starts to kind of trail off as the area gets hotter. And then we get into our August sampling, we're looking at around about an 88% for the third set of samples. And this is just on the fully curtailed system. So fairly significant. We got a long way to go to climb back, and it'll be very cool to see how we get there. And I want to emphasize again that this is, we've got whole field data, everything from the whole field bale counts, confirming what we're seeing down at the forage and closure scale. Next slide, Alex. This is just kind of an example of where we are on the data that we're collecting right now, and the kind of way that we represent this is that, again, you'll see there in 2021, 2022, we'll be fully irrigating these fields. These are the reductions that are more or less represented by those numbers that I just showed you. So, we were comparing the initial June dry matter biomass, the July and the August, and then later on in September with the treatment conditions. And so, again, just a graphical representation of how much reduction we get. Those of you that are sort of astute farmers may look at that tons per acre number, and it might seem a little high. So I just kind of want to caveat this and say, these are based on these, somewhat small footprints. And then I did get the bale counts recently, so there may be some adjustments to this, but the trend is not going to change. So, what we'll be looking for in subsequent years is to see how far those short bars kind of climb back up into how compared to the reference conditions. Quick point to make on this, the designation so far as the research design has us looking at what we call reference, which is represented by the R, and then L, which is the low production spot, and H, which is the high production spot. So within those 6 treatment fields that Paul mentioned earlier, we have 2 of these research enclosures where we look at the impact on the forage, and the producers helped us identify the low and the high production areas. So we have kind of this productivity gradients, if you will, to make sure we get not, again, just taking advantage of the size of the system. So we can get a better representation of not just the impacts, but the recovery pathway. A similar convention goes with the T1. We get the L for low and the H for high. So yeah, it'd be pretty interesting to see how these start coming back in the subsequent years after a 3-year project. Next slide. Nora just asked a question. So yeah, these ones that I'm showing here, the treatment is considered full season when I know these for the particular field. What you are looking at, this slide and the previous one, these are the full season curtailment graphs. I do have one for the partial season, and you will see the difference. This one got kind of lopped off at the top, but I guess one thing that really, I find fascinating is that the producers absolutely identified where their high production and low production areas are. So, we've got the benefit of these 5 composite samples around that forage enclosure. So I guess the point I keep trying to make here is that we've got a lot of spatial data regarding forage as well. And you can see that the carryover treatment condition, carryover moisture effect in this particular field was quite a bit better. So those treatment fields didn't suffer quite as much, but still, gets baked into that average of that, it's 73% average reduction during that first cutting, then that 87%. This field, by the way, the previous one had gotten baled, which is why that cutoff happened so much more rapidly. And then this one has just continued to be, hay continued to be produced on into when it ultimately gotten grazed. So, we're collecting a lot of data related to these specific fields, as well as the specific kinds of farming practices that are done here. Back in Nora's question, next slide. Here's the partial season curtailment field, these RSR location. And on this field, it's the comfort level I have with this is, again, we got the low and the high production areas that worked out really well. But there's no difference because we did capture that. We actually captured that, what we call the July cutting, or I'm sorry, we captured the June. They did cut off in June 15th, but then that carryover moisture that was still in that soil continued to benefit that field into our July sampling. So in terms of the split season, there was really no negative impact to this field to be determined. I mean, it did work out to about a 15% reduction in ET, but the yields that we're looking at are fairly low as well, that would correspond to that reduction. So partial season is needs to be looked at in the context of how much water is yielded versus economic impact of the farmer, which in this case could be argued is fairly low. So we'll keep tracking. We have other partial season fields in this study as well, but this one kind of represents the trend that you would expect. Next slide, Alex. I think I'm decent on time here. Just field result season highlights. We're very happy that we have the remote sense and the ground-based data. They're closely aligned. Every one of those forage enclosures does have infield soil moisture sensors that we can do sort of a one-dimensional water balance off of, and that's actually a more large data set for all the different fields. So that'll be in the report that we put together. Gives us the ability again to kind of stitch a remote sensing estimate to an infield estimate in multiple places. So while infield sensors of that sort are not as accurate as eddy covariance, it gives us more spatial coverage for lower cost. So that's another component of ground-based data. Again, I like to kind of come back to this point is that we're coming at that conclusion here that these consumptive use measurements are scalable, useful, and translatable. So remote sensing tools, we talk about that ensemble model. I would say we could begin to think about using them for actual ET numbers or actual ET estimates across the state for whatever purpose they serve. But OpenET is a great group, and this data is becoming free to all who want to use it. So these are numbers that will be made publicly available. Reminding everybody there, we got that 42 to 45% consumptive use reduction, and as of right now, the forage yields and results are sort of in line with our expectations, and that scale of this project, I can't overemphasize, gives us such a valuable, farmer level. It's a lot of times farmers I look at, work with a tiny little research enclosure. Well, that doesn't represent my whole field, but here we're talking about whole field analysis. I think that's where we get farmers and scientists to begin talking about the same scale of the actual operation. So as we look at that recovery pathway, previous data from Joe Brummer and my own looks at what we see on average about a 3-year recovery timeline, and that there's a question there about how you bake that reduction subsequent years into the one-time lease payment. Those folks that are involved in that set of negotiations, I think, will benefit from having these kinds of numbers. Next slide, Alex. The way we look at our what we call enterprise budget, which is kind of jumping off of this forward yield reduction thing, is that we're developing a tool that builds off of the classic CSU enterprise budget. And an enterprise budget is basically a fancy spreadsheet that takes into account estimated production costs, and returns. So you got there that first box up in the top left. This would be an example of sort of how much yield. This is taken from average enterprise budget data for the Western Slope that our ag business management team put together. You look at yields of say 2.7 tons per acre. There's a yield price on average $232 per ton, and so what we'll have in those green box columns there is the farmers can put their numbers in for ideally a reference condition, or in their mind, what the reference might be versus the direct costs of actually engaging in the project. So if they're continuing to farm as usual, fertilizer applications, there might be some herbicide applications, some swathing harvest costs, and some other, economic details that get us down. It's kind of tight in there, but your eyes might be able to get you to the number $304.84 per acre total direct costs. And then that last little number down there under the per acre column, that would be the sort of return to management risk, so profit, in other words. This is again the average Western Slope number for the state, or for the Western Slope for grass hay. You can imagine then that this gives us the ability to do sort of a parallel comparison. What are the management costs, the direct costs associated with managing a field that's in curtailment? Now, there are costs. What are the management costs associated with returning that field to production? There are costs associated with that. So we can do multi-year farm scale economics, and this tool will be available to producers that would want to use it. Obviously, one of the gross receipt inputs is going to be that water payment. So that would go into the input side of where they're coming from. And so what's really interesting about this tool that our team uses is the sensitivity analysis, which is that final box there on the side. And it basically gives the producer to sort of play around with, what if prices go up or down? You could even throw in water payment up or down. What if yields go up or down? And you can sort of like, what is the break-even number for making the deal make sense? I'm about end of my time here, so go ahead to the next slide. Last slide for me. The key questions on the social science are essentially these considerations that producers are going to make about deciding when to participate in the project. So the benefit here is that really talking to the producers that are in the know about, they're on the field, in the ground, in the county, in the know about what their experience is with these kinds of programs. Do their considerations about the project or their feelings, as Paul said, change over time? If so, how? If so, why? What are the networks of the producers? How are they talking to each other? So it's kind of like getting an anthropological or sociological insight into the mindset surrounding programs like this. And I think that adds a nice context that gives us a little bit more than a binary yes or no, I'll be in or I'll be out. And so the process by which we engage in the social science is we have Kelsey McElroy is doing a great job performing these semi-structured or sort of conversational interviews, but they do have certain points they're trying to hit. And then she'll perform this social network analysis to figure out. As we all know, Paul Boucher is right at the center of all that, and has been a tremendous colleague and collaborator on this project. Honestly, I like to say I've never had a better, farm collaborator than this. He's just an incredible leader. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Seth.
All right, thanks, Barry. Super interesting and exciting stuff. My name is Seth Mason. I represent Lodak Hydrological. We were asked to participate in this project last year in a capacity primarily focused on understanding the effect of these water conservation measures on reach scale and basin scale stream flows. The motivation for including this investigation as a facet in this much broader project is to better understand the environmental consequences of participation in conservation programs and to validate some of the analytical approaches that we use to anticipate outcomes of these types of activities at the field scale. Next slide, please. So our general conceptual models of irrigated systems suggest some different mechanisms by which stream flows might differ in years during typical irrigation practice versus those years when irrigation is curtailed by way of full season or split season leasing like we have going on in the Kremling area. During typical irrigation years, we might expect that some fraction of applied irrigation water makes its way into alluvial aquifers and returns to waterways as lagged groundwater return flows. This is not news to any of you on the call, I'm sure. The expectation is that this would lead to some propping up of late season flows when compared to years when conservation measures are enacted.
And these late season flows may be relevant to habitat quality, for example, for fall spawning fish species. Conversely, in water conservation program years, less surface water may be diverted from streams and rivers at head gates through some portion or all of the irrigation season, leading to higher flows in the river through the summer months when water is otherwise warm. Water temperatures are elevated, which may be harmful for aquatic biota. We know that water temperature can be an issue on the Colorado River, at least in this part of the state, when flows get low. So the impact of water conservation and stream flows is therefore highly relevant to understanding these secondary environmental consequences of these types of actions, and thinking about how surface water is affected by participation in these programs also has a lot of bearing on the thinking that's going on at the state level about the administrative challenges surrounding management of conserved water. Kelly Thompson's on the call here today, I believe, and he's doing a lot of that thinking, incurring a lot of brain damage, I'm sure. So we have these simple conceptual models that we operate under, but there are a lot of assumptions that underlie these conceptual models that may or may not be valid on any given parcel and may produce some challenges when attempting to anticipate outcomes across scales. Perry talked a lot about scaling of approaches and thinking across scales, and certainly we want to be doing the same when we're thinking about stream flows as we're doing when we're thinking about things like evapotranspiration. So the assumptions that we're thinking about here are reflected in a lot of the analytical models that we use regularly to characterize the water balance at the field scale. These models, many of you have used these, track water between the point of diversion, move water across the field, evaporate some of it, transpire some of it, infiltrate some of it, move it into aquifers, and eventually back to the stream. Of course, this is all done in kind of simplistic one-dimensional modeling terms, but we find that they are useful kind of coarse models for predicting outcomes of different water management strategies. We do it all the time, all across the state, and we don't always understand whether or not our assumptions are valid, the assumptions that go into use of those models, and therefore there's some amount of uncertainty inevitably that's associated with any of the predictions that come out of these models. Of course, the real world's a lot messier than we describe it in our models. We've got variable soil characteristics, variable crop characteristics, variable aquifer characteristics, water left in the stream at any given head gate due to conservation, for example, might be used by another junior user in the system between the point of historical diversion and the point of presumed return flow. We may have variable evapotranspiration rates across time and space that are not well accommodated by our simplistic mathematical models and might not have the advantage of the very robust data collection efforts that Perry is leading in the Kremling zone, and on and on. So the work that Perry's team is doing, is conducting, is really focused on tightening up the water balance at the field itself. As we heard a lot about, the aspect of that work that's focused on improving estimates of evapotranspiration rates, there's soil moisture monitoring occurring. And the work that we're doing then, next slide, please, is really about kind of scaling up a little bit and thinking about the water balance, not just the field scale, but between the point of diversion, between the stream where water is moved out of the channel to the field for the purpose of irrigation, and then down to the point of presumed return flow, lagged groundwater return flow or surface water return flow. So zooming out a bit, broadening our thinking about the water balance and working to collect data that can be informative in that regard. So in 2020, we went out in the field and we performed numerous synoptic stream flow measurements above points of diversion that supply water to the participating parcels, and then below points of presumed groundwater return flow. We did this work on the Colorado River and on Pass Creek. You can see the maps here indicating locations where we collected stream flow measurements. We also have water temperature probes in the water that Grand County Water Information Network has placed out there for us. We're doing this work with an acoustic Doppler current profiler, so we can collect up to 14 replicate measurements of discharge at any one location at any given time. Have a pretty good sense of our measurement errors at any given location. We're repeating these measurements between the period extending from August to November, and hopefully using it to understand how upstream downstream changes in stream flow are driven by or influenced by participation in water conservation efforts. Next slide, please. So these measurements of stream flow will be repeated in 2021, and the combined set of data will be used to do several things. At the most basic level, we're going to describe statistically significant differences observed in upstream, downstream stream flow and water temperatures adjacent to project parcels across our two different year types. So 2020, of course, the year when we've got people enrolled in the program. 2021, everybody returns to historical irrigation or typical irrigation practice. And the hope here is that collection of data across these two year types and at this pretty high spatial density along the Colorado River and on Pass Creek will help us understand whether or not project participation, whether or not water conservation of the type enacted here indeed produced measurable differences in stream flow. And that term measurable being important. So we continue to collect additional data alongside the discharge measurements. We're looking at historical irrigation diversion records. We are collecting information on diversion practices in 2020, and we'll do the same in 2021. Working with the River District to understand reservoir operations at Wolford, and trying to think pretty broadly in a semi-quantitative narrative sense about the ways in which water conservation enacted across the Kremling area under this project influenced reach scale and kind of larger scale, basin scale changes in stream flow. We'll also use the data that we collect to develop an analytical water balance modeling code base, and that'll help us. We'll then use that modeling code to understand where and how our modeling tools are most sensitive to uncertainty and variability in data inputs. Those areas of sensitivity or uncertainty are then perhaps the data types to focus on in the future when we are thinking about where do we put money as we enact conservation efforts to ensure that we understand outcomes. Where do we put money into data collection and monitoring? We'll also use this code base to produce, ideally, in the Kremling area, more reliable estimates of some of these difficult to measure stream flow impacts across space and time, and then package the whole thing into a public tool that can be used by NGOs or state personnel or other stakeholders to approximate potential stream flow impacts of water conservation measures in similar settings. We expect that tool will be useful for informing decisions about where conservation measures are more or less likely to produce measurable changes in stream flow. And of course, there is some risk here of duplicating efforts. The lease fallow tool being developed at the state is certainly being pursued. That development of that tool is being pursued in a similar vein, and we want to make sure that we are leveraging and informing any of the work that Kelly Thompson's doing and not duplicating efforts. So we'll continue to coordinate with folks over there to ensure that we are achieving synergies where possible. In closing here, unfortunately, we don't have useful results to share with you from this last year, because our assessment really does require the comparison of data between our two year types from 2020 and 2021. So we do look forward to reporting back to you next year with a much fuller characterization of the impacts of water conservation on stream flows. I'm going to hand things back over to Paul to wrap up.
Thanks, Seth. Thanks, team. So moving forward, lessons learned. Next slide, please, Alex. So, first of all, we actually did it. Talked 9 crusty old ranchers in Grand County into drying out 1,142 acres during a global pandemic. Pretty remarkable. The last in-person meeting before the state shut down that I attended was the CWCB board meeting on March 11th, to my wife's displeasure. So we actually accomplished it. Very exciting. There were 2 slight flaws within the project. We figure roughly that we were successful on 98% of the acres that we attempted to do treatment to. The 2 slight flaws involved in a free river condition, slight more use of water on an upstream neighbor than anticipated, and trying to relieve the downstream flows was more challenging. Another one, leaky railroad track pipe. Didn't anticipate that one coming. Very, very minor impacts. The other neat thing that happened within this, and Perry talked about it, but it actually takes more to manage non-irrigation than you might think. The producers were awesome in that Gore Pass area. Literally had water police officers of landowners running around assisting me. I had to buy a new cell phone because my battery wore out based on the number of calls I received. But it was great to see the actual participation in the producers in assisting to get this project done. On the other side, the variables of the project, the things that we couldn't control, what a wild year last year was, very low precipitation in the Kremling area. The fires and the impacts of this on some of the social science. I think if we had had a heavy monsoon sort of a year and not, the wildfires in Grand County that we had, the producers might feel one way. I think that there's good and bad takeaways from that, because people in the beginning of the summer season that thought we were crazy for doing this and didn't necessarily understand why water conservation going into the future might be important. By the end of the year in Grand County, people definitely understood that our conditions are different than historically they have been. Another takeaway from this, grazing, we knew that there would be different impacts. I'm very excited to see the end of this year in recovery, because as different producers utilize their meadows for calving or for fall pasture, we're definitely seeing an early season difference in recovery. It doesn't mean that that's the whole story. We still have an abundant amount of growth season left, and we'll continue to evaluate that as time goes on. Next slide, please, Alex. So with that, very important to understand everyone's irrigating this year, and we will continue this study through 2023. And I think that that's a really important part of this. We've got a year slice of data information, but to continue this, and especially for the producers end of it, as far as what compensation might look like if you're participating in a water conservation program, this recovery of forage yield. And it's not only the volume and quantity, but also the quality and the different species, really evaluating, in a stress season, what can actually come back. With that, I became a farmer with a couple of my other neighbors and my father this spring, in very small plots to not disrupt the study at scale that Dr. Cabot mentioned. But within each of these treatment areas, we took about 2.5 acres where we tried 5 different practical farming techniques, reseeding techniques, both overseeding, drilling, aeration, things that would be pretty doable practices to replicate, to see if we stressed a meadow in a condition like this, if it became more realistic to look at it from what would be a sod-bound condition to how we could actually introduce, other species, and we'll continue to study that. As Seth mentioned, continuing to understand everything going forward will be very important regarding the river, the water systems associated with it, the continued enterprise budget, evaluate the soil health practices. Now that we have, a year of compiled data, this is not all fields are created equal in their soil health, and not all perennials are created equal in what can look at to be their recovery of a practice like this. So, we will be sorting through all this over the years to come, and just endless amounts of data. And really every time you turn a corner, there's something else that you figure out that you want to do. The continued survey and social science work continues. The continued bird and habitat studies. There's so many different parts to this, and we will continue to do that. Audubon participated, in a bird survey. Turns out there's lots of birds around here. We'll see those impacts to how many were around last year in a treatment, and then this year in a recovery, and see what continues to go on. And then Kelsey and I are currently working on another grant to write a book on my feelings associated with this work, because we've determined we should write a book about it. I'm just kidding about that. Next slide, please, Alex. So with that, in summary, we continue to work on this and find our conservation tools that can support productive agriculture communities and the environment. This is trying to put all the pieces together so how this can function, instead of an on-off and roll the dice and see what happens, that we're getting the best science data and research, that if there are programs like water conservation programs, that we're going into it as heads up as possible. We look forward to ongoing continued updates to those who are interested over the coming years, as there will be more and more data and information associated with this. And finally, we wanted to give a big thank you from both the Colorado Basin Roundtable and also the project management team to the Colorado Water Conservation Board staff, and especially Mr. Alex Funk, our master compiler, for the ongoing support of this project, self-proclaimed master compiler. Thank you all very much, and I think we'll move on to.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, no, it's certainly been an interesting project, especially given all the challenges of the last year. But yeah, no, excited to kind of start seeing these results trickle in and sort of the project moving forward. And I mean, just as another update, I mean, we approved another ATM grant to kind of continue this project, really kind of looking at that recovery time and kind of gathering those results, and really looking forward to maybe doing another webinar at the end of this project to kind of really kind of understand sort of the full scope and sort of results there. I guess with that, if there are any questions, again, just a reminder, we've got about a little over 10 minutes here before we kind of wrap up. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll kind of go from there. I guess while folks are thinking through those, I guess I had one initial one for the project team, and just kind of open it up a little bit, but I guess kind of just based on the first year of results in terms of sort of the forage impacts and sort of the consumptive use findings. And in terms of designing water sharing sort of programming or conservation programming on the Western Slope, sort of involving these high elevation systems, what sort of advice would you, I guess, initially have to program design in terms of sort of maybe mitigating some of these impacts, or sort of working with producers? And are there sort of any kind of key takeaways that you would sort of recommend in terms of sort of program development? And anyone on the team can kind of feel free to weigh in on that. And again, others feel free to chat in the meantime, and I'll kind of go from there.
Questions?
Okay.
Well, when we initially looked to put this together, there were certain fields that were pretty simple, right? Smaller tributaries, more isolated. It was more of a head gate on or off kind of a scenario. Also, though, a heads up that on the surprise side of things, and that's something that, I personally irrigated for a neighbor for 4 years down there on a meadow on the river. And unless there was enough flooding flows to overtop the riverbank, I would have bet my life savings account that if the pump wasn't on, it wouldn't irrigate. And then we had a leaky railroad pipe. So these kind of variables and how knowledgeable you think you can be about these kind of projects, there will be curveballs, but I think, on the positive end of the curveballs is that we were able to mitigate them, at any kind of large scale.
Hey, Alex, I know you had to unmute me. I'm not in the realm of water leasing arrangements or anything like that, but it's really important to understand that the contrast between the perennial systems versus the annual systems is, it's night and day. So we see a lot of these kinds of brown and down, lease and cease, you know, whatever kind of things where like I was growing corn and now I'm not going to do corn and then I'm going to go back into corn, control some weeds in between. These systems, the economic impact, and I would probably even argue that the consumptive use impact, because those consumptive use numbers, you know, we've seen in some cases higher numbers after, you know, periods of stress. Now, it'll be interesting to see if that shows up. I don't think in these grass conditions and shallow rooted conditions that will tend to happen as much. But this is like a 3-year calculus for a producer. So it wouldn't surprise me if producers, you know, might take away from some of these, this research, this awareness that, you know, what they're economically considering as their impact is going to include a recovery pathway as well. And so I would almost argue, I mean, that's certainly, it's not knowable, but it's, I mean, it's, what is that phrase that, you know, it's a known unknown. So we know that it's going to happen. And so we have to be able to come up with a way to kind of standardize the discussion around those, you know, those impacts, and then just be comfortable with the assumptions that are made. And similarly to the consumptive use values.
Thanks, Paul and Perry. And I guess happy to kind of keep asking questions, but I guess any other of the project team, any sort of, I guess, any thoughts that maybe weren't captured in the presentation, or sort of initial responses on kind of where you see the project going, or sort of see how you see it informing sort of similar efforts on the Western Slope, or sort of Colorado generally, in terms of sort of, you know, sort of these like system potential conservation scale programs, or sort of any sort of where you kind of, Perry.
Yeah, so I'm fascinated. Paul kind of just briefly touched on this, but I'm fascinated by this sod binding thing. I mean, Joe Brummer has looked at research when he was up in Mountain Meadows in Gunnison. And for those of you that don't know that term, it's basically the effect of, you know, compaction and rockier soils. So you have this kind of sandwiching effect of where roots can really collect on a field like this. And I can tell you, it's all over the place based on how cut up my hands are from trying to install my own irrigation system. They're just rocks and stress on both sides of the sod. And so producers tend to experience this slow change to a more bound up system, which these lease programs, I mean, it's an amazing insight. They have opportunity to give producers a chance to remediate those soils in between periods of curtailment. So just like these programs we've seen where maybe a producer wants to shift to organic and they're taking 3 years off from irrigation, this is an opportunity to do some real soil health remediation. And then some of that, requires some tillage and other things that my regenerative ag colleagues would just, they just would excoriate me for advocating something like that. But if we have an opportunity to do a really good one-time soil health remediation, everybody can come out a winner. So I'm really fascinated by being able to pursue some of those ideas as well.
So just to add on a little bit to Perry, I think that he described that very well, but now we're talking about potential, water conservation programs that spiral into a pathway of greater sustainability. And we talk about this, it's far too early, so don't get too excited yet, but a simple technique of some pretty deep aeration followed by a power seeder within these meadows that were fully curtailed. The concept being that they were stressed enough that we might be able to have a more productive interseed. In 2 hours, I have a forage expert coming over to come and look at it, because the meadow I was in, I was so excited. You can see the drill rows, you can see the clover coming up. And it appears there can be some kind of possibility of this with simple techniques, simply with a 1-year curtailment, but far too early on results, but just excitement.
Oh, here we go. Got a question in the chat from Jacqueline. kind of open up to Paul, Perry, or Seth. Anyone looking at sort of general water quality impacts as part of the overall project?
I can jump in and just note that as far as we're getting into water quality is the look at water temperature. There is no looking at chemical constituents in the water column, but we should have a pretty good sense of any of the potential relationships between changes in water management and patterns of stream flow, groundwater return flow across the project area, and that one physical aspect of water quality, at least. And I'd also note that there continues to be quite a bit of water quality data collection in this part of the world not related to this project. So there's always a chance for some retrospective analysis later, although may not be perfectly designed to answer questions about the impact of conservation.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, coming in now. So we have one from Nora. And maybe this might be a question for Paul and Perry, but how did participation in the split season or full curtailment impact grazing management last year?
So on the split season side of things, we had a field that has reliable water supply in late into the summer, early into the fall, where the producer is able to put another amount of water on the meadow after haying. So clearly an impact because the yield was less than it would have been. The full season was dramatically more. I mean, I think that anybody that ranches at high altitude maybe didn't have a full area of water, even if it's just a small portion of a meadow. But I think that last year's dry summer season surprised us all at the limited amount of any residual forage on a fully curtailed field. And in one particular case, the producer runs on a large-scale forest permit, and the cows have to come off at a certain time of year, and they came back to a place where there was nothing for a cow to eat. So they had to work some additional lease agreements with some neighbors to distribute some livestock for the fall season before feeding happened, and there was actually kind of great dry summer season.
Great, thanks, Paul. Any sort of last minute questions out there? If not, I mean, definitely any sort of just closing thoughts for the audience from the project team on sort of where things are going, or sort of maybe, yeah, I guess last minute reflections before we call it quits today.
Just my sincere thanks to not only the Roundtable and the CWCB, but also to the project management team. You know, we had to be pretty brief in the description of the project partners, but based on the moving parts of this related to so much research, it has taken a team to get this done and very involved. And we have agreed for 0 Zoom meetings for at least 2 weeks based on that same concept. But a sincere thanks to everybody, because it has taken a huge amount of effort on a lot of people's parts.
No, we appreciate it, and it sounds like y'all did such an excellent job explaining this project that, yeah, we answered a good amount of questions, but it sounds like, looks like there might be some interest in sort of doing some follow-ups and a little bit of a roadshow on this topic. So yeah, definitely appreciate the project team and sort of looking at some of the sort of unique issues involving these types of projects, and really look forward to kind of continue working with them on the results. And again, if there are any sort of additional questions that might come to mind after the webinar is over, definitely feel free to reach out to either Aaron or Melly. They've listed their contact information here if you want to hear more about the project. We did record the webinar, so folks that had to jump away or kind of came in a little late, you'll get a link to watch that after through the sort of Eventbrite registration link, and can kind of rewatch any sections that might have been of interest. But really appreciate everyone's time this morning, thanks again, and hope everyone has a good rest of their day, and we'll be be in touch soon with more updates on this really exciting project that's happening up in Grand County. So thanks again for everyone, and take care.